Hello, I'm James. I'm here with our in-house painter Marc. Today we're going to talk about some of the projects you've been working on, and we've got these Sarissa Japanese buildings that you did.
Yeah.
So these were built already.
They were. So Dan, the editor and owner, lovingly crafted these for me.
They're his first ever MDF buildings that he put together.
He did a splendid job, I have to say. I mean, it's
stable.
It's not falling apart. So he was actually kind enough not to attach a few pieces.
Yes,
as well,
we can get into that as we go.
Which really helped. So some genius suggested that he did that.
Was that you?
It was you.
Oh, okay. Just sort of leading you into that. Yeah, so these are all from Sarissa. It's the temple, the bell temple, but we built it without the bell because for the article that these are for, which is the outrage at Jeddo, it's more to represent a tea house almost, and then this one's just
the samurai house.
That's right. So yeah, so some of these are quite large, but you painted these really quick. So we figured it'd be a good thing to kind of just pry into your mind and find out some of your approaches to these and how you went about it. So what's your process with MDF kits?
One of the wonderful things about MDF buildings is very quickly you can accumulate a large number of buildings, and you can knock them together and have an array of buildings ready for your battle top. One of the problems with them is that MDF is quite flat, as is obviously the nature of the material.
Yeah.
So whenever you're painting it, the key thing is to try and extract as much texture and develop as much depth as is possible.
Yes.
So that was my key aim when painting these. Not only was it to paint them quickly, but it was also to paint them with as much texture and as much depth as I could eke out from each model.
Yeah, I mean, you've definitely done that because, like, obviously, when they're on the tabletop, you're mostly seeing them from above as well. So you've got the roofs which draw the eye, and then you've put quite a lot of detail around the sides of these as well. We're just looking at the tea house, as we're kind of calling it.
The tea house.
It's less of a house, but
you'd get very cold if there was a breeze.
yes. But yeah, you've approached this in quite an interesting way, in that when you look closely, there isn't a lot going on, but from a tabletop view, it looks great, right? So what techniques do you use for that?
So to paint these, I started off pretty much airbrushing every aspect of this, and particularly this build. Obviously, there are certain parts of it which required a bristle brush, such as this top component. As I mentioned, Dan left certain parts of it separate, which enabled me to airbrush them without having to worry about masking or either with masking fluids or with tape or blue tack or other medium.
So was that like the...
So yeah, this fence, this was left separate. This actual top part of the tea house was left separate as well, and even the steps which led up they were also not fixed in place, which was ideal for this project.
So yeah, so you could do it in sub-assemblies, and you could paint this grey, this brown, and then just touching up elements like this, as you say, with the brush. And then what about these other ones? Because we've got the main temple.
This one proved a bit trickier.
Okay.
Had I built this myself, I would probably have painted it all before assembling in any capacity. As you see, red on white. As soon as you're trying to paint those, it's problematic. So I did initially paint it all with an airbrush, all white, grey tone, and then I had to paint by brush all of these red components, which, as you can imagine, took quite some time, and the process would have been much quicker had I painted all of these support struts initially with the airbrush and separately with the white, and then built it.
Would it have been possible to build this full frame, and then, because these parts here are actually cardboard rather than MDF, would you have then been able to just
slot them into position?
Sort of put them on from behind?
Potentially. Obviously, I never saw the components before they were built. So, but yeah, that you could have built the entire frame potentially, and then painted them red, and then fitted these into position after they'd been painted.
Because it's a really cool kit. I mean, the detail on it is great. Yeah. Obviously, you kind of miss it because you're just seeing this giant roof. The roof
dominates.
Yes,
it really does, and which is
you've paid attention to it, right?
Yeah, which is why most of the focus of the weathering, in particular, was on this roof. As you saw when we were rotating around, I did do some weathering on the white components as anyone that's got any rendering on their house will know, white very quickly becomes green, brown. It loses that purity.
There's not really white in wargaming.
There's not much white in wargaming, no. And I wanted it to have a slight, more organic feel to it. And also, when you're using greens around on these bits, you can actually add that extra depth as well by focusing the greens on these components around this bottom here, and it adds that extra depth and shadow. So coming back to the roof, the way that I did this, so initially, because this roof is made of cardboard, I sealed it all initially with a varnish. You could seal it with PVA glue, and obviously it would do the same effect. You'd try and make it as waterproof as possible, so that when you apply the paint doesn't warp any of this card. Once you've applied the PVA or your varnish, I then coated it in just effectively different grey tones, and I used my airbrush again to paint this, and as you can see there are slight different tones of it to represent where light would bounce differently off the surface. Then I sealed it again. I love sealing painting so that it doesn't get damaged. The more of these videos that we do, you'll notice that I love sealing things.
Like a drinking game. Every time you say sealed it again, you have to take a shot.
You'll get very drunk very quickly.
Yeah.
And then I weathered it using both weathering pencils and enamel paint. So the green tone is from an enamel paint, which I just basically rubbed down in lines, and then using a saw edge brush and an enamel thinner, just brushed down, and again it gave that streak effect. With the brown tones, that was a brown weathering pencil, which exactly the same process, but just a different medium. Again, streaks, this time with water on a brush, you then just brush it down, and it fades it out and creates that natural bleeding effect, which weathering and rainwater will give.
Yeah, it almost looks like a kind of moss almost as well on top.
Yeah, that was the aim, to make it like moss and dirt and grime, which had built up over the years since the temple was constructed.
Yeah, I mean it's really effective. And then you've got the final one here, which is, this one's a bit more of a kind of a richer sort of colour palette overall. Quite a lot more browns in there. And again, is this one that was part built, or was this one?
This again was part built.
Right.
Thankfully again to Dan, he did a wonderful job on this. The fence itself was part constructed, and the roof still detaches, as you can see. Yeah. I'm not going to remove it because we don't want to
reveal the inside.
We don't want to reveal the inside. The inside is not painted. You can paint it if you choose.
Yeah.
But again, the same process. We weathered it on the roof, as you can see. And I also used a little bit of sponging effect to just add some texture along these edges.
Is that just like a household sponge?
So yeah, simply just find any sponge you've got laying around the house, to be fair, either one that you've got from a blister pack, so one that you use for washing up, any kind of sponge works. You tear it up and you basically need to just texture the edge, and then you just sponge your paint on. Very much like with dry brushing, you want to ensure that your sponge doesn't have too much paint on, otherwise you'll have just big blobs of paint on your miniature. You don't want that. You want this textured kind of small dotted effect to create that impression of, I'm assuming these tiles may be terracotta looking at the colour, and you want them to have that natural texture.
Yeah, because I mean, the sponge effect is actually one that's really worth putting in your arsenal, because you can use it even down to like 28mm figures to add either dirt or chips to armour and things like that. So, and use different sponges, right? Because you get a different finish.
Very much so. Yeah, amongst my sponge collection, I have a collection of sponges. I have a whole array of different, I don't want to say gradient, different degrees of sponge.
Density of sponge.
Density of sponge, we'll go with that, yeah.
From fine to SpongeBob SquarePants.
Indeed. So.
Who lives in a pineapple under the sea?
I even use the same sponging effect on the wood just to make it have a little bit of extra pop. Otherwise, the red fencing would have looked just quite flat against the rest of the miniature, which, as you can see, we put quite a lot of effort onto this roof line. I didn't really want the fence to just look really bland in comparison.
Yeah. But again, it almost acts as like a backdrop for if you're down crouching, getting line of sight on the tabletop. It's not too distracting, but it's got a little bit of interest, and then you've got the the fanciness of the roof.
Very much so.
Yeah, and they look really good together, and they look great in the scenic shots in the article as well, which is a pretty cool
Ultimately
one.
what we're aiming for, wasn't
Yeah,
it?
yeah, it's about ninjas attacking a British compound in the 1800s, so that's one worth looking out for in issue 405.
This video has been brought to you by WI Prime, Wargames Illustrated magazine's online members club. View more videos or find out more about WI Prime by following these links.